It has been a glorious, glorious time on the internet lately, hasn't it, everyone? The fighting game discourse is always really interesting, especially when something big gets announced. So, yeah, what has been happening in the world of fighting games, right? Street Fighter 6 gets announced. I mean, Street Fighter 6 was already announced, but like it gets a bit more detail, it gets a bit more of a reveal. It gets a year. It's coming out in 2023. That's a good goal, right? So I mean, like, okay, a little bit of a background here before we get all the way into the fighting game approachability stuff. All right, Street Fighter 6 gets announced, and along with a couple new characters, new details about the system mechanics and how some of it's going to work, and then there was a complex mode, or a modern mode, and a classic mode of controls. Sorry, that's what they are called. You know what? Here, let's welcome to the new era. Oh man, we're going to be getting to the approachability alignment chart in a sec, Mib, and yeah, motion sickness is something that's going to be a super interesting thing to look at. I'm going to have some fine definitions for y'all. Like, listen, I have a big problem when it comes to a lot of the discourse in fighting games, in part because I'm like, people are not working off of the same definitions. So we need to have the same set of definitions going forward. But first of all, let's check out. Welcome to a new era, a smart and stunning evolution and innovation from Street Fighter 6. First of all, why can't this be the logo? Why can this not be the logo? Like, I love the graffiti art style here. Stick with that. There's a lot of really cool stuff to talk about with Street Fighter 6, and I'm going to get into some of it, but I think a lot of people have already done the huge breakdowns and such. But I think it is worth looking at their modes. So look, these are the new systems. The drive system. You have something that's a little bit like a parry. You have something that's a little bit like an FADC. Something that's a little bit like a V skill. And it's going to be tied. But this is the context that we need for our little approachability splatter chart here that we're going to do. The control types, folks. This has been an ongoing discussion in fighting games forever. It's the perennial discussion of, are we dumbing down our fighting games? Are simple inputs ruining our fighting games? This, that, and the other. Or are they the savior of them, and that traditional fighting game controls are the bane of new players' existence and must be destroyed at all costs? It's neither of those things. Let me get this straight. It is neither of those things. Like, I think it's really interesting that, I mean, I like me some simple input, some lenient input fighting games. I love Fantasy Strike. I love what Murphite's doing with their lenient input systems. I love that Heatwave is like, Nabi, we're breaking this down a little. You can get complex in some ways, but the inputs are not going to be where you're getting complexity from. So I love that. But I also love, like, Marvel. And I also love, ridiculous optimal combos in Street Fighter. And KOF. Show me some wild KOF touch of deaths. Like, I want all parts of that, right? So, but every time we have this discussion, it feels like it's always one or the other, right? It's like there's no middle ground in all this, and we gotta simmer down a bit when it comes to this discussion. But so what happens? What happens when a major franchise announces their next mainline game and says, one of our core things is we're having a modern and a classic input method? Street Fighter 6 offers a new control mode to play without the need to remember difficult command inputs, allowing players to enjoy the flow of battle. Players who are delving into the world of Street Fighter for the first time, or those who haven't touched a fighting game in years, can jump right into the fray. Of course, the traditional control type of the series is still available for players who enjoy it. Now, right off the bat, this is being positioned from this like copy. It's being positioned as modern. This is the new way we do things, but the classic mode is still available to you. So this is insinuating a little bit to me that the modern mode is their design default, but they hedge it with new players or returning players. Like, so how committed are they to this? I'm not entirely sure. And I think this is where the big issue is with approachable control systems, where when you build an approachable control system, especially if you're incorporating one-button specials, this is something that fundamentally changes how the design of the game and how it's operated. Not having that wind-up for, like, frame one invincible reversals changes things. You do not have to do the mental math required to say, am I able to input this in time because button, right? That changes things. Doesn't mean it's better or worse, but it's different, and you have to account for that. If you just slap the one button system into a game that doesn't really accommodate that, where it's like we designed all of our frame data and all of our exchanges and the pace of play and the feel of the game to be designed around the classic system, and then you slap a modern system on top of it with one button specials, you're gonna get some stuff that breaks, right? And that's gonna be a problem for competitive players, for casual players, for how those two mix. I see there Punk saying that not calling it simple mode or stylish mode or whatever it is, but calling it modern and classic is a really interesting distinction. I think this is part of it where the developers of Street Fighter have said to themselves, look, this is a trend that has developed in fighting games as a whole, moving towards a more lenient input system. So that's the modern school of design thought. So that's going to be called modern, but the classic one, not archaic, not old, not like OG, but the classic one, the way we used to do it. That's there, and that needs to be there because that's part of our legacy. That's part of our heritage. So we're going to keep that, right? And we're going to offer tools for both. Now, if the Street Fighter team is designing this in a way that they say, hey, we're recognizing that these things are going to be intermixing, right? Like, if they don't say, hey, you can't, like, if they limit you and say you cannot play the modern mode online because online is competitive and competitive means classic, that just wipes the slate clean. They haven't made any real consideration as to how they're doing that. They'll let people play single player mode and get into it, but if they want to play the real game, they got to learn the classic mode. And then that's not very reassuring if that's the way it goes. But I believe that you can develop a game that caters to both styles, like in a single package. I believe you can do that. I think it's ridiculously difficult. I think you need smart and clever developers to really care about both systems and catering to both of the consumers who like the players who like modern styles and classic styles. You have to be able to cater to them both within the same package. If something fundamentally changes the way the game is played to alienate one of those two, then you're not doing your job. That is a really difficult job to do. I don't know how many studios are going to be able to accomplish it, but I think it's possible, right? So I think it's worth looking at. Why 20X? Personally, I think people who want classic inputs, excuse the French, are greedy. You have decades of classic input games, and you can't accept one major title going in a new direction, especially one that is still leaving the classic inputs in there. Fair point, right? Like, and this is what one of the conversations that I had on Twitter actually was about this, where I'm like, look, are people opposed to the concept of lenient inputs, or are they opposed to the fact that they know that lenient inputs will change how their game functions, and they don't want their franchise of choice to change in that way? I understand that. Like, if you like the Street Fighter paradigm, and yeah, you wouldn't want a lenient input system coming in and changing that paradigm into something that you don't personally enjoy. Sure, there are other games out there that might do the mechanical, technical thing in a similar way, but maybe it doesn't have the right aesthetic. Maybe it doesn't have the right community. Maybe it doesn't have the right archetypes that cater to you. Maybe there are other things. There's not just inputs when it comes to how a game works that determines whether or not you enjoy it. So there are all these other things besides the, like, you know, sometimes decades of investment in a community of a certain franchise, which does bear weight in the fighting game community. It's difficult. It's difficult to say, no, my game can never change because I like it that way, because, hey, what about all these other people? But at the same time, I get why players are like, no, I don't want that lenient input stuff coming in and changing the game and the world that I know, right? Which is why it becomes very difficult. If you can't accommodate both of these styles in a game and you have to pick one or the other, I think there is a general trend in fighting games over the past 20 years where they have moved in this direction. We have gone from old, like, 80s fighting games that were like 2 buttons, right? And then you moved into the 6-button era into the 90s. And then some games started paring down. Some only went up to the 4-button, the SNK fighters, who only are 4-button fighters, right? But they have complexity in all these other ways. And then you see the Marvel games. Oh, it's a 6-button Marvel game. And then, oh, the versus games are 4 buttons, and oh, they're 4 buttons and a special, and now they're not, you know, light, medium, and heavy, and you get medium in a different way. It's, oh, you have A, B, C, and D, right? It's like stripping down the size of the button real estate has been a very real thing in fighting games as time has gone on. We never truly lost the 6-button fighters, but I would say that this trend probably does exist. So you could be worried that Street Fighter 7 would say, hey man, forget all the classic stuff. We're all modern all the time. I've seen a lot of developers say this, where they're just like, just don't. Just never, ever, not even once, incorporate both of these methods into a single game, because you're gonna piss someone off to the point where you lose them completely. So why do it, right? Why split the base and do it half-hearted for both when you can dedicate to one and say that's what we're doing? I can respect that, like as a perspective, but I want to see them try, and I'm glad we've seen this a whole heck of a lot in the indie and A and AA space, but not so much in the AAA space. So let's see what they do with this in the AAA space, incorporating this modern design. So what the heck is this modern design? You only get light, medium, heavy, and special. It's no longer a 6-button fighter, it's a 4-button fighter. Oh, what did they just do? They looked back in time and said, hey, this is how we just did the gradual progression with our Versus series. So let's apply this thought process to Street Fighter. Yeah, the idea of simple fighting controls wasn't necessarily a competitive concept. I think it was just a matter of they wanted people to play these games, and as the games themselves got more complex, like, look, you think of it, every iteration of a game, your players are getting more intimate knowledge about the systems, and they get better and better at doing things. And so it's like, man, hopping into Marvel vs. Capcom 3 is like not playing the first 50 levels of a puzzle game and hopping into puzzle 51 and saying, I don't understand how this puzzle game works. Of course you don't. You missed all the things leading up to it that taught you why you should know this and how to do it, right? In order to accommodate for that, we're going to have brand new people who've never played the previous Versus games come into MVC2. So let's simplify the system a bit. Oh, we're going to have brand new people coming into MVC3 who's never touched a Versus game. Let's simplify this a bit, right? I think it was about getting a wider, broader audience than anything. You have an assist button, you have dedicated throw, drive impact, and drive parry. So you have dedicated buttons for the different new systems that you have, and you have an assist button that lets you hold it down and then tap attacks to do auto combos. And you get various auto combos with various enders depending on what buttons you're using. Now, I will say, as an approachability measure, this is actually okay. As an accessibility measure, where you then have to do the press and hold and the rapid presses, that is extremely difficult for people with certain things. Like, I have family members who have arthritis, and they would never in a million years be able to hold down that R2 button while mashing. They could probably do one or the other, but not both at the same time. Just a little distinction on the difference between what is approachable and what is accessible. Like, approachability is about easing people into the concepts, while accessibility is about allowing people to perform the thing. And oftentimes an approachable tool will allow someone to perform the thing. So it can act as an accessibility tool, and vice versa. An accessibility tool can make things easier for newer players and ease them into things, but they are not one and the same. So we got our 1-button specials. And then here we go into the classic control type. Classic 6-button, light, medium, heavy punches, motion inputs. Now, this is going to have a fundamental thing where you're going to be limited to only 4 special moves: neutral, right, left, and down for your specials, and then possibly whatever aerial ones. But if you have a character with a large tool set, you're not going to get access to all your tools. You also only have access to 3 of your 6 normals. So I'd be curious how they balance this, and how they're would give people enough tools to be competitive while not giving them the 1-button inputs that negate the competitive aspects of what the classic mode entails, right? Like, walk forward flash kick is going to be a problem if you don't take that into consideration. So how are they taking that into consideration? Remains to be seen. Yeah, I'm committing to the term modern inputs just for the sake of conversation, because Street Fighter is kind of the impetus for all of this right now in this current instance. So I'm let's lean into that. Let's go with modern inputs and, classic inputs. But I'm also a fan of the term lenient input. That is something that I think kind of covers the broad range of ways you can do this. So what did I do? What did I do when I saw all this? What modern input fans believe. This, folks, for those of you who don't know, in 2015 or whatever, Sterling Games put this out as part of their pitch for Fantasy Strike, where they were like, look, we got all of our big-ass, normal, complicated fighting games over here. We have Dive Kick as the exemplary, simple game. And then we have Fantasy Strike in that sweet spot. And this is what a lot of modern modern input fans believe the state of the game is like. Now you have people who are no, I don't like simple inputs. our fighting games are getting dumbed down. And they think all modern fighting games are down here. Stupid baby fighting games, with Fantasy Strike at the lead. And then over here, fucking melty. Whatever, right? Choose your complex game of choice, right? And throw it over here, and you got one of them now. This is also not fucking reality. Because my friends, this is way closer to reality. But look at it, guys. We have Dive Kick. We have Nair, which is literally, it's like, hey, what if Smash Brothers, but all you had was a neutral air? We have One Strike, which is like the Bushido blade of modern, one-hit fighters, right? We have Bearsis, along with Dive Kick, a slightly more complex version of Dive Kick with a slightly larger tool set, but similar, hey, it's a two-button fighter. We got Fantasy Strike, and we got Tough Love Arena, and we got Arcus Chroma, who all do similar things with hey, we don't have a dedicated jump button, we don't have crouching, right? And then we get a little bit more complex. You get games like Heat Wave, which has some approachability efforts, but isn't really designed to be a lenient input game and has some great complexity to it. TMNT Cross Justice League, 4-button fighter, 1-button super, a retro CPS2 style fighting game that has a huge wealth of depth and complexity. Robo-O, a 2-button fighter, but holy heck, it's more like Street Fighter 2 or Street Fighter 3 than anything else. We got Merfight, which has dedicated lenient input systems, but is also a very complex and very intricate 4-button fighting game, kind of in the wild mesh of KOF and Street Fighter. And then, dude, we have all of our other complicated legacy fighting games, which are still way more complex than a lot of the other stuff that I just talked about, on top of stuff like Dual Souls, which is probably the single most systems-rich fighting game I have ever played. I think Five Force Fighters is going to challenge that. And then we have Motion Sickness, which is, hey, let's meme on complexity in fighting game controls. Oh my lord, you can go so wildly complex with that game. And yet, people look at the fighting game scene and see this. Or see this. And we need to get past the idea that approachability in fighting games is limited to this and this. Because this and this is actually super boring. This is so interesting. This is so rewarding and has so much to offer the community. And I think the number one thing I think that really bugged me is I kept getting responses to my tweets here that were saying, hey, you picked a bunch of simple input fighters. Why do Fantasy Strike fans have brain rot? And I'm like, I think it is a testament to how little people know about these games and know about our own scene, that they thought, A, these are all simple input fighters, and that B, really? You don't know about it? You don't know about 80% of the fighting game scene out there? This is way more representative of the large number of fighting games that are coming out than Street Fighter, KOF, Tekken. People look at fighting games and think the big, 4 or 5 franchises, right? And then ignore that there are dozens of games that come out every year that cover the whole spectrum of approachability and complexity and art style and theming. And there's some that focus on single player. There's some that focus on multiplayer. There's some that are co-op fighting games, right? Do y'all know Cerebral? You need to go check out Cerebral. No one's talking about that. Why aren't people talking about 2v2 fighting games, man? Sorry, I'm getting a little heated here. I apologize, folks. I think that comment really, really bothered me and really exemplified the problem that I have with this whole conversation. Yo, that punk. Thank you so much for the sub, and thank you for agreeing.